Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation on enhancing EU-U.S. cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. We had a wonderful, rich discussion on economics, so we're now going to turn to security. But I think as an important theme that was pulled out from the first discussion, you really need that strong economic foundation for a strong security dimension as well. So let me, because time is short and we have a fabulous panel, let me be very brief and introduce our panelists and then turn to them for their insights. And I have to say, I was the person who was too cute by half and talking about the better together, obviously pulling from the Scottish referendum slogan of better together, how we can be better together with the EU and the US and security. So let me begin. We'll start with Dr. Amy Searight, Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Southeast Asia at the U.S. Department of Defense. Amy has been a stalwart in attending CSIS discussions on how we can bring Europe and the U.S. together more in the security dimension in the Asia-Pacific region. Dr. Searight serves as the principal advisor at the Defense Department for all policy matters relating to defense strategies and plans for the Asia region. So she's an extremely busy lady, and she joined the Office of the Secretary of Defense in October of 2012. And prior to that, she served as the Principal Director for East Asia. And before that, she worked at AID as a Senior Policy Advisor for Asia. So you were smart power. That's what we call you. So thank you, Amy. After Amy provides her remarks, we're going to turn to Matt Palmer, Director for Multilateral Affairs in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. Matt has served, you are the perfect Europe-Asian nexus.
I'd like to think that's true.
You are. Because prior to the gig at the Multilateral Affairs Office, Matt served as political counselor at U.S. Embassy Belgrade and had an earlier tour in Nicosia in Cyprus. So I love that combination. Previously served in the policy planning staff at the State Department, as well as Director for Europe at the National Security Council. But what I'm going to intrigue you with, Matt is also a novelist and has written 2 phenomenal books, The American Mission and Secrets of State, which NPR thinks are some of the best books they've read. So not often do we get a novelist and a foreign policy expert at the same table. So Matt, thank you so much and welcome. Then we'll turn to Klaus Botzit, head of the Political Security and Development section at the EU delegation to the U.S. Klaus is such a well-known colleague to all of us. He's served at the EU delegation since March of last year, but had served here in a capacity in the German embassy. So he has served both in the German Foreign Office for over 2 decades, also served in the External Action Service as in the German Foreign Office as the head of division of the U.S. and Canada relations. So Klaus, we're so delighted that you could be with us and give us the EU perspective. And then finally, we'll turn to Dr. Mike Green, Senior Vice President for Asia and the Japan Chair here at CSIS, turning to Mike to play what I like to say cleanup, which is the best position on a panel. You get to say what has not been said, or you get to jibe your other panelists to get them to provoke to other comments. But we're so grateful that Mike is here with us. Mike is not when he's not at CSIS, he serves as the chair in modern and contemporary Japanese politics and foreign policy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He has served with distinction at the National Security Council as a director for Asian affairs and also as senior director for Asia. But we are so glad we can call him our own at CSIS. So Mike will take us home. So with that, thank you. We're going to talk security. We're here reading in the news surface-to-air missiles potentially placed on the Woodley Island and the Parcel Islands. We are talking about reclamation islands and freedom of navigation and sunny lands. So Amy, you're the perfect person to help us understand all of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to CSIS for convening this very important discussion. I am always happy to participate. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about ways that the United States and the EU can work together to enhance security in East Asia and the Pacific. I think it is appropriate to begin with, pointing to the recent, the just concluded meeting at Sunnylands between President Obama and his 10 ASEAN counterparts. This is just the most recent example of the emphasis that the United States has played on Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific in the rebalance that has been the signature, the sort of hallmark foreign policy under the Obama administration. And within the rebalance, sometimes we talk about the rebalance within the rebalance of, really trying to rebalance our attention within the broader Asia Pacific to Southeast Asia in particular, and ASEAN as an organization and a venue, a vehicle for engaging these countries on things like building up a security architecture and promoting security cooperation. So I think Sunnylands was very significant. The declaration that came out of Sunnylands, the so-called Sunnylands Declaration, laid out, I think, a very positive and promising view of the region and of U.S.-ASEAN cooperation going forward. It focused a lot on economic cooperation, which Matt Palmer can talk a little bit more about, and some very good principles laid out for maritime cooperation and maritime, principles of maritime security and stability in the region, really hinging on the respect for international law, rule of law, and upholding, key principles like resolving disputes peacefully and upholding freedom of navigation and other core principles that have been so important to this region. We know that America's future is linked to the future of the Asia-Pacific region. That's sort of the foundation of the rebalance. And we firmly believe that the future of the region depends in many respects on the United States. But we also see the EU as a critically important player in the region. And the strategic stake for the EU is very high in terms of the stability and prosperity of the region, from maintaining stable trade relations with China and other countries in the region like Japan and South Korea, while supporting the dynamic growth and emerging prosperity of Southeast Asia, and I would add India. Southeast Asia nations, of course, sit astride the key global trade routes that link the economies of Europe to the U.S. and East Asia, and it's home to a very diverse ethnic and religious population, and the security architecture is really vital to maintaining stability and security in the region. As recent developments in the South China Sea have shown, Southeast Asia also hosts some of the most sensitive and intractable security problems and potential flashpoints in the world. So resolving these issues really does require a global approach, and we welcome greater EU engagement with both the U.S. and the region. And in particular, we welcome discussions about how the U.S. and the EU can work more closely together towards our shared goal of promoting international law and international rules-based order in the region that allows for the peaceful settlement of disputes, freedom of navigation and overflight, and unimpeded commerce and exploitation of national resources in accordance with international laws and norms. It's also, I think, very important to point out our shared values in terms of democratic governance. We share the belief that open societies with democratically elected governments provide the best foundation for a stable and prosperous region. And governments in the region that support universal values related to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the ability of civil society to organize are more able to contribute to the region's stability and security. So given our shared interests in the region and the potential for greater security cooperation, I want to turn to some of the immediate challenges we face in the South China Sea and sort of the U.S. approach to those challenges. Certainly recently, the region has seen an uptick in problematic and destabilizing actions in the South China Sea. Some claimants have taken provocative steps that are obviously aimed at changing the status quo, and this has caused tensions to spike and relations between neighbors to deteriorate. Vessels have been engaging in some dangerous behavior as they are challenging each other in these disputes. As we've made clear many, many times, the United States does not take a position on the sovereignty over land or artificial features. This is an issue that has to be resolved by the claimants through negotiations and through legal mechanisms. But we do take a very strong position about how these disputes should be resolved, which is to say that in pursuing their claims, countries should not use intimidation, coercion, or force against any of the other claimants. These actions are by anybody are simply unacceptable. So we continue to urge diplomacy and, when appropriate, reliance on the international legal mechanisms such as the UNCLOS arbitral tribunal that the Philippines has submitted a case to. We also believe that countries must ensure that their maritime claims comply with the international law of the sea, and we oppose any effort to restrict or impede freedom of navigation or freedom of overflight or other lawful uses of the sea by any party. So that's why we have questioned many of Chinese activities in the region, from its drilling operations in disputed waters, which was accompanied by numerous paramilitary and military vessels, to continued restrictions on access to Scarborough Reef and interference with the Philippines' activities at Second Thomas Shoal. It's also why we have very deep concerns about China's extensive land reclamation activities at several features in the South China Sea, and the continued construction of dual-use military-civilian infrastructure on man-made islands, despite the Chinese President Xi Jinping's comments when he visited Washington here last year that China has no intention to militarize the South China Sea. To fair-minded observers, it appears that China has undertaken a concerted and proactive approach to exert control over contested areas. It's not hard. This absurdiveness is clearly aligned with China's growing military capabilities. So it's important for China to understand that its actions are not viewed solely in the context of territorial or maritime disputes. They're seen as indicators of how China will wield its growing power. So when I travel the region and meet with my counterparts across Southeast Asia, India, I continually hear very strong concerns expressed by those in the region about Chinese behavior, Chinese activities, and the strategic implications that they hold about how China will wield its growing power. But as concerned as we are about Chinese activities in the region, I want to be clear that we are not siding for or against any claimant, nor are we assessing whose claims are valued. We are committed to, as I said, rule of law, international law, and so we are eagerly awaiting the UNCLOS arbitral tribunal ruling, which will be binding on all parties in our view. And we are committed to peace and stability in the region based on a rules-based international order. And we've undertaken a number of activities to underscore our conviction that freedom of navigation and overflight are an essential part of this. In terms of freedom of navigation operations, as I'm sure you've seen recently in the news, that in January we conducted a freedom of navigation exercise by sailing a destroyer, the USS Wilbur, within 12 nautical miles zone of Triton Island in the Paracel Islands chain. Triton Island is claimed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan, all of whom have tried to require any vessel to request permission to transit the area, which is inconsistent with international law, regardless of who the claimant is. So we were challenging that excessive claim. As President Obama and Secretary Carter have frequently stated, the United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. So we conduct freedom of navigation operations all over the world. We've done this for decades, and the South China Sea is no exception to that, and so we will regularly exercise freedom of navigation operations into the future. This recent one was not a message that was intended exclusively for China, but to the broader region and to really the world, that the United States rejects any nation's attempt to restrict or impede freedom of navigation that's conducted in accordance with international law. Turning to just broader areas of cooperation, the U.S. has developed a broad interagency approach to uphold maritime security in the region, and we welcome a more coordinated relationship with the EU in enhancing the security environment. We have a number of opportunities to work together across a range of security issues, including securing freedom of navigation and overflight to enhancing the regional state's ability to deal with non-traditional security challenges, such as counter-piracy, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and disaster relief. And in particular, I want to highlight something I'm very busy with at the moment, but it's our attempts to build capacity in the region particularly around the issues of maritime domain awareness. This is related to Secretary Carter's announcement at Shangri-La Dialog last June that the Department of Defense would put $425 million into a new Southeast Asia Maritime Security Initiative, which over the next 5 years is going to really take a strategic approach to how we can build capacity in the region. We're looking to increase key countries in the region, their ability to to sense, share, and contribute. So their ability to sense by improving their maritime domain awareness capabilities so that they know what's going on in their own EEZ and can act accordingly. To share that information with their neighbors so that everyone is operating from a common operating picture. Everyone sort of has the same information and they can make joint effective decisions together. And then to contribute to regional security by acting on that information and protecting their waters from all kinds of intrusions, from illegal fishing to working together in an HADR contingency, a disaster relief contingency response, to dealing with counter-narcotics, human trafficking, other kinds of issues, to, of course, protecting their waters from, from coercion of any other state. So our Maritime Security Initiative is something that, I think would be an area where we could certainly have discussions about how we could work together to build these capabilities, to sense, share, and contribute to regional cooperation. In closing, I just want to say, we can't overstate the importance of upholding the principled international order that has underpinned the decades-long peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific. As the security environment continues to evolve, it's even more important that countries continue to be able to rise and to prosper. And this will not happen on its own. It's going to require leadership of those that have served as champions of this order really since the end of World War II. Every country, no matter how big or small, must feel free to pursue its interests in accordance with international law, and for peace and stability to reign for another 7 decades, we need to work together to ensure that the international order not only persists, but grows stronger in the years ahead. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much for that great overview. Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much, Heather. It's always difficult for the Department of State to follow the Department of Defense. As Amy was speaking, I was mentally sort of cutting out the stuff that I have in my points here that she covered more than thoroughly and adequately. So I'm left, by my count, with about 15 words, which means that I will be brief.
You're not going to get that off that easy, by the way. Okay.
But what I really wanted to focus on was EU-U.S. cooperation in the Asia-Pacific. And the United States and the European Union share values and interests. And while that is not true exclusively in the Asia-Pacific, it is also true in the Asia-Pacific, where we support a rules-based system, the peaceful settlement of disputes, respect for international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And you see these areas for cooperation not just in a geographic sense, but you see it in an institutional sense, and you also see it in a functional sense. And I'd like to address just some examples of that in each of those areas. Dr. Searight spoke at length about the South China Sea. But again, this is another area where the EU and the United States have a lot in common. Our interests are closely aligned. The South China Sea is an important global waterway for trade. Many EU members are significant maritime nations, and all are tied into the global trade networks. We work together to reinforce the principle of freedom of navigation as a matter of law and as a global norm. And the U.S. and the EU have been strong supporters of the negotiations on a code of conduct in the South China Sea. The upcoming ruling in the Philippines v. China case in The Hague is an opportunity to reinforce the importance of both rule of law and the peaceful settlement of disputes. And I think Amy addressed some of the specifics of that, again, quite thoroughly. I'm going to skip those bullet points. North Korea, another area I think where our interests are more than closely aligned, where you see essentially 100% overlap. We share a fundamental interest in the de-escalation of tensions in Northeast Asia, denuclearization of the peninsula, and there's a significant rule of law component here as well, respect for the raft of UN Security Council resolutions specific to the DPRK and the sanctions regime aimed at enforcing compliance. With respect to ASEAN, I think there's a particular area where the United States and the European Union are cooperating closely and well and can do even more. The U.S. and the European Union have a shared interest in a strong, unified ASEAN at the center of a rules-based regional security architecture. We're working to strengthen ASEAN and its institutions, including the Secretariat. This year, we saw the launch of the ASEAN community, which we consider to be a real milestone achievement for ASEAN as an institution. We're supporting it politically, we're supporting it programmatically, and the EU has a lot to offer in terms of building these kinds of multinational regional groupings of nation states. No one has done this more thoroughly or with more pages of regulations than the European Union.
Thank you.
Said with affection.
But in all seriousness, Brussels and the EU member states have experience in this that we can't match and significant credibility. And it's an area where we have been working well and closely together, and I think there's even more that we can do. Just a few minutes on some areas of functional cooperation, if you'd indulge me. The first is counterterrorism, where the U.S. and the EU work with Interpol and the UN ODC to combat a range of transnational crimes in Southeast Asia, including trafficking in weapons, people, drugs, and wildlife. We both seek to understand and counter radicalization in Southeast Asia, strengthen investigation and prosecution of terrorism cases, and counter the financing of terrorist activities. We work side by side in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, and the EU has been very active on border security in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. In October of last year, the EU began a program called the EU-ASEAN Migration and Border Management Program, and I don't want to steal your thunder if you're going to be talking about that program in particular. But there's some details of the program that I'll defer to you, Klaus. But at Sunnylands, the U.S. announced a similar $2 million program focused specifically on countries that are potential transit countries for foreign terrorist fighters. We see this program as highly complementary of the EU program. We're working through Interpol and the embassies in the region to identify mutually reinforcing training opportunities and areas where we can pursue technical assistance. A few thoughts on ports and border security. This is an area where the United States and the EU work side by side to minimize the risks associated with dual-use products, industrial substances, and chemicals that are potentially harmful in the wrong hands. These substances must be carefully controlled through export control regimes. The EU and US provide advice and capacity development on strategic trade management laws and regulations, as well as training and equipment for border security programs. By ensuring the security of cargo, increased export controls can incentivize further trade as ASEAN strengthens its economic community. The US and the EU also work together to mitigate the risk of accidents or attacks involving chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear material. The EU and US support capacity building and training in CBRN-related matters, including first response, nuclear forensics, and CBRN waste management, as well as the drafting of legal frameworks. I know waste management is always a fascinating topic. It really brings people in, but it's extremely important stuff, and it's technical, and it's an area where we have a lot of expertise, the EU has a lot of expertise, and what we do and what we need to continue to do is to work together to coordinate the programming, to reduce redundancies and make sure that what we're doing together is mutually reinforcing and supportive of our common goals and objectives. As part of the EU CBRN Center of Excellence Risk Mitigation Initiative, the EU supported the creation of a regional secretariat for Southeast Asia, hosted by the Philippines government, that provides assistance to ASEAN member states on conducting assessments, establishing national CBRN teams, or drafting CBRN action plans to ensure proper response and coordination. That's the kind of thing that we think is a fabulous contribution and matches up well with what it is that we're trying to do as well, both politically and programmatically. A few words, if I may, about cybercrime, where the US and the EU are working to advance regional cybersecurity and cybercrime deterrence capabilities. We're seeking to help the countries in Southeast Asia fully adhere to the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, the Budapest Convention. We also both fostered legislative development and cybercrime investigation public-private partnerships, and a range of other efforts to counter cybercrime. The areas where we work most directly and most closely together tend to be a little bit programmy in nature. And I appreciate that when I talk about these things that it can sound a little dry. But what it gets at, what the issues are that underpin these programming decisions are fundamental to the peaceful, prosperous future of the region, one that's based on rule of law, transparency, accountability, good governance, the peaceful resolution of disputes. The fundamental strength of the U.S.-European relationship are these shared values and these shared interests. And they are operational everywhere in the world, and the Asia-Pacific is no exception. I will stop there, and having stolen so much of what I'm sure Klaus was going to say.
By no means, Matt. Thank you so much. I couldn't have said those things any better. Thank you. Well, you got already an important message, the one actually I wanted to open up with, and this is the EU is intensifying its engagement with Asia as a whole, also in the area of security. And the way we are doing it in a systemic way, it's in a sustainable way, we hope. And we are also aiming for lasting impact. The other message I wanted to open up with is that we want to do this in a very strong cooperation with our transatlantic partners, with the United States. And this is already in the making. We share basically our political goals as well as many interests in Asia. We share the interest in strategic stability above all, in security. We share the interest in open markets and strong trade relations and continued development of those. And the EU, above all, is a community of the rule of law. This is what has kept us together for more than 62 years in Europe and made us strong. And so it's no wonder that our core principles, democratic principles, the rule of law, the respect for international law, is also at the core of our policy towards Asia. The EU strategy addresses Asia as a whole. Of course, it addresses China, but also the other countries in the region. And obviously, ASEAN is a natural partner for us, where we also, as an EU, have a comparative advantage to deal with. As I said, we have more than 60 years experience with regional integration in Europe. We have built European institutions and working with ASEAN to strengthen institutions of ASEAN as a whole. There are similarities between the regions which are striking. Well, Europe as well as ASEAN countries are very diverse. They had a complicated, sometimes conflicted history, learned over time that cooperation, opening up markets, adopting single standards, allowing for the free movement of people, giving the rule of law supremacy in all areas, is to the benefit of all, and this is what we're sharing with ASEAN. And Matt indeed has already covered a lot of that, what we are currently doing with ASEAN, but let me highlight some points where we're headed with ASEAN. We're aiming to establish a strategic partnership with ASEAN, a comprehensive partnership with strong elements in the political and security field, in the economic area, and people-to-people relations. Security issues obviously must be fully part of that. The EU is a strong natural supporter of ASEAN regional integration. In 2015, there has been a ministerial meeting, and that produced a joint communication which is titled "The EU and ASEAN, a Partnership with a Strategic Purpose," and this is what it is. You won't be surprised to hear that EU is major donor to ASEAN in the period from 2014 to 2020. There is the EU has committed 117 million euros in addition to the much larger bilateral envelopes for this policy. The focus currently is on supporting the goal of the ASEAN single market. In the security field, the EU has significantly expanded cooperation in this area, for instance, through initiating a high-level dialogue on maritime security. But it goes way beyond that. You have mentioned some areas, Matt. Just one example is that we're engaging ASEAN in open sky negotiations. Singapore in particular is taking a strong interest in that, and in their estimate, such an agreement could generate profits up to 900 million euros per year, 860,000 passengers in both directions per year. So it's very concrete. We're really making progress. And last but not least, also the former relations are making headway. The EU has officially opened a delegation in Jakarta at the seat of ASEAN at the beginning of this year, on the 26th of January. I was very impressed this morning when I read the Sunnylands declaration. I must say it really contains all the elements we could also subscribe to. I have no instructions to this, but I think we could sign too. A few short remarks on our relationship with China. Gunnar Wiegand has already spoken to this. The EU has an utmost interest, obviously, in a prosperous, stable China, which is integrated into the international order based on international law. As I said, the EU is a community of law. It's our nature that we're going this way. As you have heard already, the EU is now working on a political strategy to engage China politically as well as in the economic area, and this strategy will have at its core elements also the legal rules, the law-based order. Let me stop there at the moment. Perhaps we can do more in the discussion and come back briefly to our transatlantic engagement. As you've heard, our positions are very close together. I think significant signal is that our new managing director, Gunnar Wiegand, made his first business trip, so to speak, to Washington, D.C., and we'll take it from there to Asia. It gives a signal also. What I would conclude is all countries in the region should expect strong transatlantic unity on all the issues that are on the table, and a strategy that is based on, as the Romans would call it in good Latin, divide et impera, or divide and rule, is not going to work. We are going to stay closely together in our principles. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. And Mike, every good CSIS panel knows we can't have this much agreement, so I hope you will provide us with some disagreement on this panel.
Well, I want to start by saying I agree with everything the previous speaker said. If Konrad Adenauer or George Marshall or Dean Acheson heard that we were talking about waste disposal, they would be tickled pink. This is exactly the kind of transatlantic fiber and tapestry of common values and law that was the whole purpose of U.S. policy and policy across Europe, and it succeeded. But I was also listening to everyone thinking of a story that Rich Armitage sometimes tells. When he was in the Pentagon, Heather and I have both worked for him. In the mid-'80s, during the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces negotiations, NATO basically agreed with the Russians to move the SS-20 missiles over the Urals. And Japan and Korea said, wait a minute, your backyard is our front yard. And Rich tells the story of how he tried to tell a delegation, in this case a NATO delegation, about this. And the lead was from Britain. You may have heard this story. And this distinguished diplomat said, young man, all this talk of Asia, as far as we're concerned, it might as well be the other side of the moon. That clearly is not the case today. The connectivity in terms of global issues and economics between Europe and Asia, it means that there's no mistaking the common interests we have in everything you heard, in a rules-based open order developing in that region. That said, most EU-U.S. dialogues live very comfortably in a Lockean space. And so I want to briefly play Hobbes, because Asia is 21st century interdependence and rule-making, but it's also 19th century, some would even say 13th century, civilizational rivalries and danger. So let me focus on the Hobbesian space for a moment. China is in the news today because of these surface-to-air missiles that were deployed on Woody Island. They've already deployed J-11 flankers. China's operational tempo, the PLA Navy operational tempo is unprecedented. Very often there are two surface action groups operating on either side of Japan. The PLA Navy, PLA Coast Guard is now larger than every Navy in the region except the U.S. China's about to deploy 5 new Coast Guard cutters that are 12,000 tons, the size of a cruiser or a light carrier, not to mention a new carrier. If Xi Jinping meant it when he said China would not militarize the islands, he forgot to tell the rest of the Central Military Commission. He promised when he was here last that there would be some agreement on cyber. Cyber attacks have actually increased on the United States and allies in Asia. And in space, anti-satellite capabilities are on the march to the point where many U.S. planners now question whether we can assume that we could use space in any kind of crisis. We're at a situation where, as one senior Australian official put it, American allies are looking at the possibility that in a crisis in the Western Pacific, the U.S. would have to fight its way into the South China Sea. Now, people point out these islands, these runways, that's an easy target. This aircraft carrier, it's an easy target. I'd say 2 things to that. First, not if you're the Philippines, not if you're Vietnam. And second, not if it's a crisis and you now have to worry about whether you can operate in that region and have to divert forces south. So the entire First Island chain becomes a front, and U.S. forces, for the first time since 1944, think that in a crisis to operate in the islands, or the First Island chain within the South China Sea in particular, we would have to fight our way back in. That is not just a military, but a geopolitical game changer if that's where this ends up, and that's sort of the kind of capabilities that we're looking at. Meanwhile, in North Korea, the Kim Jong-un regime has moved much closer, some say have already crossed the line, towards achieving their aim of a deliverable nuclear weapon. They already have well over 200 missiles that can hit Japan, and are close to if not already capable of delivering a device on Hawaii or even the continental United States. Recently in Berlin, the North Koreans sent out a delegation to meet with some colleagues from CSIS who came back and reported that the North Koreans are uninterested in returning to earlier agreements. They want a mutual arms control negotiation with the U.S. as a fellow nuclear weapon state, where we negotiate the terms of our respective deterrence, as if they were the Soviet Union. Now, there is good news. We, for example, have done polling of elites in Asia at CSIS, and interestingly, in spite of these challenges, a majority of elites in Asia think that over the coming decades, the U.S. will still be the leading power in the region. And just as importantly, almost every state in the region, elites answered that they want more engagement with the U.S., not less, and that they want a continuation of a U.S.-led order, even if U.S. relative power declines, more than they want sinocentrism, a U.S.-China bipolar condominium, great maneuvers among the states. They are most comfortable with something like what we have today, which is a U.S.-led system, but one obviously where other powers are more and more important. So there's clearly a desire for more American engagement, more rule of law. When we asked about norms like rule of law, women's empowerment, human rights, and democracy outside of China, the answers could have been the EU among elites, and that would not have been the case 10 years ago. So there's a lot of positive momentum for the United States, a lot of reasons to have confidence in an open and rule-based order. But these challenges I mentioned earlier are not trivial and are very, very worrisome and will really consume the time of the next administration, as they already are, this administration. So in this environment, what can the EU do? An earlier speaker, I'm told, said the EU is not a geopolitical actor. The EU is not in a position to send fleets and forces, perhaps, but I think the influence on future thinking about order in Asia that Europe can bring to bear is quite considerable. And I'll mention just a few things and stop. One is, my sense is we have insufficient dialogue between EU member states, Brussels and Washington, about the nature of order in Asia. When Xi Jinping gave a speech in Shanghai, was it last spring or the spring before? I'm losing track of time, calling for a Eurasian security concept with opposition to blocks, which is exactly the language Gorbachev used in 1986 in his famous Vladivostok speech to try to undermine U.S. alliances. Most people miss this. We should be talking about the nature of order in Asia. We should be paying very close attention to things like China's One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road. Not because it's a threat, could be an opportunity, but because it spans from the Far East to European member states. And we ought to be talking about what that means and what infrastructure development in Eurasia means and what useful Chinese contributions there are and what we should collectively stand by in terms of principles of development, transparency, and so forth. We should be thinking about how we can reinforce ASEAN states who stand by the rule of law. And I'm particularly thinking of the tribunal decision that will probably come down this June about the Philippines case, where I think most experts expect the tribunal will rule that China's nine-dash line is not the basis for a territorial claim. Now, I don't think the U.S., Japan, the EU are going to take a side on this issue, but it would be a very powerful thing if we all collectively welcomed the tribunal's decision, urged a return to a dialogue with ASEAN on the code of conduct and so forth. There are very concrete, actionable things the EU could do that would resonate if well coordinated with the US, with Australia, with Japan, Canada, and others. And then, on this issue of regional order, I think we need to continually talk to each other about how we can focus on not just China, but the rest of Asia, and not just ASEAN, but Japan, Australia, Korea. I do a lot of US-EU dialogues. They're interesting. We learn something. But the tendency is always to go to the China question. And as our good friend and mentor Rich Armitage put it in a report about 7 years ago, if you're going to get China right, you have to get Asia right. Beijing the Chinese leadership is fascinated by multipolarity. The Chinese version of multipolarity that comes out of Junanghai is a global multipolarity, where China is the Asian pole, the US is the Western Hemisphere pole, Russia is a pole, and sometimes the Chinese will include the EU when it's convenient. The kind of multipolarity we should be encouraging our Chinese friends to think about is one in which Japan, Australia, Indonesia, Korea, India are all equal, at least equal claimants, if you will, to defining the future of order in Asia. And I think in our transatlantic dialogue on Asia, we should always think about what we can do beyond China to reinforce ties. ASEAN is a good example. We now have ASEAN ambassadors. We have a very capable one right now. And so does Japan, so does Australia. There's a lot we could be doing to think about regional integration, regional order, because we have some very good people in place. So a little bit of Hobbes ended with a little bit of Locke, and over to you.
Mike, thank you so much. I sort of feel like this panel, as was described in the earlier panel, this is sort of the Asian paradox. So on this side of the panel, you sort of had the economic optimism, integration, joint activities. And this is, on the security side, the pessimism, the fragmentation of it. And I think in some ways you all were a perfect balance to that. I have one question, and I'm going to immediately throw this open because time is extremely short. So here is my frustration as we talk about the Asian security dynamic. And I think focusing on the Sunnyland's declaration is perfect. The words are perfect. We all uphold and support the principles and the values. No question about that. But who enforces these wonderful rules and international law? Because can there be norms and law if there is no one to enforce when those rules are challenged or when they are broken, whether that is Russia, whether that is China? And it seems to me that the transatlantic dimension, as well, Japan and others, sort of the Western orientation, we are fundamentally challenged by who is going to enforce these laws now that they're under challenge. And that is what I struggle with, because the U.S. has taken a leadership role in helping to defend those values in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation. It's very hard to hear Europe's voice, though they benefit from, the $5 trillion worth of trade that travels through the South China Sea. Who's going to uphold these values? And I think that, to me, is the challenge of this. We all like to point to the international law. Someone has to enforce it when it's broken. And if no one does those legal norms really exist if we don't agree to enforce them, even when it harms our economies, it harms what we're trying to achieve. So if the panel has any reflections on my paradox of who is enforcing the rules, and then I'd love to open up the audience. We'll collect a few questions and we'll ask our panelists to have extremely short responses. So anybody want to take my paradox, or you can not take my paradox?
I'll take a stab.
All right, Mike, go.
So, so I spend most of my time in and on Asia. And increasingly in the dialogue with Australia, Japan, Korea, and certain ASEAN states, what you hear in discussions is cost imposition. Cost imposition. That there has to be a cost to coercive mercantilism or maritime security pressures on small states or on cyber. And that's the nature of the dialogue. Cost imposition is not, I think, a phrase one hears probably in the transatlantic dialogue as much, certainly not with respect to Asia. But cost imposition doesn't necessarily mean moving outside of international bodies that we all support, including China. For example, the World Trade Organization. The WTO is a place where there can be cost imposition, but within a rule of law environment where China ultimately wants to be seen as a player. When we talk about the World Bank, the IMF, cooperating with the AIIB, One Belt, One Road, it's a kind of soft cost imposition if there's a set of principles and rules we agree on, and there's a reputational cost to Beijing if it doesn't go with those. Or in the ASEAN context, if it's clear, and it should be, that the code of conduct is basically a dialogue of the deaf right now, if there's a voice making China focus on its reputational damage from not having a serious dialogue on code of conduct, that's a kind of cost imposition on the reputational side. So there's the aspirational objectives that we've heard. The question is, how can the EU impose cost? And I think there are ways that it can. I think the U.S. is going to have to accept a lot more risk, as are Japan or other Asian allies. But there are cost imposition strategies. And that sounds very adversarial, but it's really about reinforcing, or rather enforcing, rule of law. And that probably should be part of the currency of our discussion.
Fantastic. All right, I see some hands, so let me collect. Oh, gosh, lots. So we'll have the mic. We'll swing to this way. So, sir, we'll start with you. If you could have your name and your affiliation, and I beg you, just very short so we can allow our panelists to respond. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gerrit van der Wees from the Netherlands, but I'm here in Washington, D.C. as editor of Taiwan Communique. We heard a lot from the panel about integrating China in the international order, rule of law, and my question goes basically the same as you were asking, Heather, and Michael was saying. China is basically saying, these rules are not my rules. I have my own rules. This banking system is not my banking system. I have my own banking system. It's telling the Taiwanese people who just elected their own president, it's my island. So how can one converge instead of diverging? Right now I see, as Michael was saying, really divergence in Asia, but how can we, we may use your words, impose cost and work between the EU and the US together so we have a convergence in Asia to indeed abide by those rules?
Hi, Brendan Mulvaney, Naval Academy. I just would like to hear, we talked a lot about the rule of law. How does Europe see U.S. actions or ambiguity in the South China Sea specifically? Are we doing freedom of navigation in open water? Are we doing innocent passage in sovereign territory? Are we doing freedom of navigation in accordance with innocent passage, which seems self-contradictory? How do our partners in Europe see this kind of ambiguity, and does that harm us in any way?
Fantastic question. We'll continue to move in the last two over there, and then we'll... Oh, so many microphones.
Doug Samuelson, Infologics Incorporated, here in Annandale. Could you talk a little bit about the health issues and the status of agreements on those? Containment of pandemics, identification of sources of new infections, humanitarian responses after crises, and that goes back to waste disposal, but it goes to other issues as well. Nice complex of issues there that I think at least have a lot of security implications. What do you think?
Thank you so much. And sir, last question.
Hello, Dan Vasquez, CEO of IntelliWings International Relations Consulting. When I was in the military, in the Air Force, directing international relations and intelligence operations in Asia and Europe during assignments there, I worked very closely with allies and alliances, NATO, in Japan, Korea. Do we need some kind of alliance between the EU, the U.S., and Asian countries? Would that help or hurt security in the region? Thank you.
Very good. Great questions, as always, from our CSIS audience. I think I'm going to go in order that we spoke. So, Amy, I'll ask you to reflect on any of the questions you'd like.
Well, this concern about China not adhering to rules, or China's view that it's your rules are not my rules, it really builds on the earlier discussion about cost imposition and how do we enforce international rule of law. It's extremely difficult. I mean, international law is as Hobbes would say, there's no real enforcer there. So the best we can do, as Mike was saying, is kind of stand up together, united in principle. That's why we think ASEAN unity is so important. ASEAN centrality and ASEAN unity is so important, and we do everything that we can, including President Obama convening leaders at Sunnylands, was very much about promoting not only our engagement with ASEAN, but trying to promote ASEAN to kind of, unify and come up with a clear, coherent, powerful voice of its own that will resonate in the region. And then I think our job as the United States, the EU, Australia, Japan, Korea, others, is to stand by ASEAN, speaking in a very loud voice behind international law. When, for example, the UNCLOS Arbitral Tribunal ruling comes down sometime this spring, I think I completely agree with Mike. We need to be ready to be very loud and vocal in harmony together standing behind the Philippines and the rest of the ASEAN claimants, and perhaps all of ASEAN, to say this is international law, this is incredibly important, it is binding on all parties. We expect full recognition and compliance by this law. Then, if China does, or any other act, they could rule against the Philippines, and the Philippines hypothetically could, take action in contravention to that. We need to stand up and say, you must be bound by this law. We expect you to adhere to it, and if you deviate from that, we will hold you accountable. We will, certainly reputational cost is at stake. But we can think of other creative ways to perhaps impose costs as well. I think that does raise the cost for China or any other country to really directly contravene international law, but it's important that we all stand up with a very strong, united voice. And then I'll just also make a comment on the transnational challenges that were raised, the humanitarian response to disasters, pandemics, counter-piracy. These are really important issues for the region. It's a very maritime space. A lot of these issues are very important and are growing more important over time. And it's an area where the United States cooperates very closely with Asian partners, but the EU as well through vehicles like the ASEAN Regional Forum. And the EU is not there, but we do a lot in the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, plus in terms of promoting practical security cooperation through multilateral exercises and dialogue and other things. And a lot of our exercises that we do, the United States does, with bilaterally and multilaterally with Asian partners, is very much focused on those set of challenges. So they're very important in and of themselves, but they're also good areas for us to work together to build habits of cooperation and build interoperability and other kinds of things that can be used in other potential situations.
Thanks very much. At the risk of cherry picking, I maybe would like to focus in on this issue of health security, both because I think it's an important issue, and I think it's also a good example of the kinds of U.S.-EU cooperation that I think represent real value added. I mean, health security is a security issue. I think that increasingly is something that is accepted and understood. It's not social work, it's security. The U.S. and the EU are, for example, if not the biggest, then at least among the biggest contributors to the Global Fund, to the UN Global Fund, targeting some of the most pernicious diseases in Southeast Asia. Zika virus has again kind of raised the focus on this issue. Malaria is a perennial concern. And we approach this together and collectively, not just the US and the EU, but the US, the EU, other donors, all really of the nation states in the Asia Pacific, in part through programs aimed at capacity building, and we obviously have a lot of technical expertise that we can bring to this, some money, some resources that we can bring to organizing workshops and capacity building. And yes, I know it sounds a little dry and technical, but it does matter, and this kind of assistance is very welcome in the region. And then the other thing is promoting norms that are an important part of health security. For example, transparency and good governance. If something happens, don't hide it, report it, open it up, talk to others, share information. And you know, we kind of see these as being obvious, but there were traditional approaches, some secretive approaches to managing health crises or outbreaks that were getting in the way of cooperation, effectively managing these sorts of collective challenges. We just look at the recent history of SARS and H1N1 to understand that this matters not just on a local or even a regional level, but potentially on a global scale. And I look at the way that the region stepped up in response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa as being an example of the way that the Asia Pacific can play not just an important role in the Asia Pacific, but globally as well.
Thank you. I'd like to make 3 points on this question: who's going to enforce the international law, and how do we deal with a China that believes that the rules that are the rules for everybody do not apply to it? I think the first point to make is do not underestimate the force of joint world opinion about what's going on. If we unanimously reject coercion, threat of the use of force, if we unanimously support that international law as formulated by the International Tribunal in The Hague in summer needs to be upheld, that's a very strong message and will be very difficult to ignore. Just to give you a small example from the trade area, the US had problems with Chinese exports, particular toys that contain toxic substances, and talk to the Chinese and say, look, you need to respect our consumer protection laws, and the reaction was not satisfactory. And the EU did the same, and the reaction was the same. And then we joined forces and talked to the Chinese together and gave the same message as a joint message of the United States and Europe, and they listened and enforced the necessary legal changes in the production. So a joint Western, a joint world opinion matters also for Beijing. That would be my first point. The second is, actually, I strongly believe China's current policy is not in its interest. It's very costly. It's investing much more into its military than relative to its economic growth. It's forcing its neighbors into alliances against itself, which positions these neighbors otherwise would not take. And the return on investment of these policies is negative. It doesn't pay off. So looking at it from a more rational, matter of fact point of view will lead sooner or later to the conclusion, why are we actually doing this? We should take another approach. So this is certainly something to consider. And thirdly, on the role of the United States in Southeast Asia and its military posture, clearly the United States has military capabilities which are exceptional, and no other country in the world is able to do the same. The United States position there is such that it's the only guarantor for the fact that the international law can be upheld, that threats don't turn into action, and obviously the European Union strongly supports the American guarantee for the international law in Asia.
Last, Mike, you have the benediction.
FONOPS, the Nike rule, just do it. This is not Macbeth. We don't need it to do or not to do. We don't need all the drama. We just do it, and we should be doing it regularly. I don't believe actually that China is trying to throw out the international law. I think China is being opportunistic, and it's like almost every other major rising power in history. Us, Bismarck's Germany in the 19th century, rising powers are revisionist in their neighborhood, and they free ride globally. It's exactly what Bismarck did. It's exactly what we did in the 19th century. It's what Japan did in the early 20th century, all of us on the British. It's what China's doing now on the US and the EU. It is revisionist increasingly in its neighborhood, but it is free riding on global challenges. You know, consumer safety is a perfect example. So I think the challenge for the US and the EU, or for Asian allies and Europe, is that the revisionist piece of regional strategy is very obvious to us and very threatening, whereas the global free riding is probably a lot more evident to Europe. And we need to think about how we can have a collective approach that takes into account both, where we impose costs and dissuade and deter revisionism, but we encourage contributions to global challenges, where China has a lot to offer, from climate change even to infrastructure, where I think if we had a common voice on the principles that should guide something like the AIIB and the One Belt, One Road, we'd be in a much better position. We didn't have that. The earlier panel probably talked about this. We diverged, visibly on the AIIB. That's precisely what we really can't afford. But I think, the more we talk about this, the more we understand this and the complexities of the problem, it becomes more and more obvious, the examples like Klaus gave about consumer safety, where we can each in our own ways put together a common approach that, builds a relationship with China and a more open Asian order that it is clearly all of our objective. And in some ways, I think, is still possibly an objective in Beijing. I don't think the jury is out yet or the jury is out. I don't think we know yet exactly. I don't think, I encourage you to look at our CSIS survey. When we asked Chinese elites, what kind of order do you want in Asia? Every other country, there was a majority view, a clear majority view. When we asked Chinese elites, what kind of order do you want in the future of Asia? The answers were all over the map. I think we have very limited influence on China, but we have more influence than perhaps we realize.
Mike, that was great advice, and strong transatlantic discussions and unity will be key. I want to thank our panelists for a fantastic discussion, a great afternoon, and my great thanks to the EU delegation for supporting our research, and to my colleague Ernie Bauer for co-piloting this research, my team for helping pull this together. So please join me in thanking our panel for a great discussion.